Welcome to this edition of Spotlight on the Collection. So happy that you could join us again. We brought some more items from the museum, and I'm actually here in front of one of our displays at the museum, the Enterprise building. Now, the Enterprise has a unique history, and that's one reason why we have this wonderful replica of what the office looked like. Its history actually takes us all the way back to very early on, about 1874. And it was by far the longest running newspaper in McLeod County. And it has seen a lot of history, and it's reported on a lot of history. And as many of you know, in this digital age, newspapers are not quite as common as they used to be. And they definitely do not have as much information in them, meaning they're not as thick, there's not as much printing that is done of newspapers. And anybody who's involved in the magazine or newspaper printing business knows it is a completely different kind of animal than it used to be in the time period that I'm going to be talking about. It was very labor intensive and costly. It's costly today, but in different ways. It's all done pretty much digitally now, and these were actually printed right in the buildings where today a lot of them are sent off. And again, this is how people got their information. So there was a lot of national news in these, not just local news. And we're going to talk to you about today some of the items that really bring the history of the Enterprise building and also of McLeod County to life. So, first off, the history of the Enterprise building. We're going to show you a picture here of what the Enterprise building looked like when it was first built in 1900. But we got to go back a little ways because it actually started, and a lot of people maybe don't realize this, in Hutchinson, and it was called the Hutchinson Enterprise. And basically, to have a newspaper really meant you had the printing equipment, and this equipment was huge. We have some pictures that we can show you here from the interior of the Enterprise building early on in the 1900s, and this early Hutchinson Enterprise newspaper was actually housed in a bank in Hutchinson, and in 1874 it decided it was time to move, and actually the press itself moved to Glencoe, and that's when it became known as the Glencoe Enterprise. It was a Republican paper, and it was owned by Sam Anderson. Now, some of you may be familiar with the name Sam Anderson from the Hutchinson area, and Sam Anderson actually was, along with Carlos Avery, one of the founders of Gopher Campfire, and very prominent in our history. So he was actually the owner originally, and he remained at the head of the newspaper for 3 or 4 years, and then it passed under the management of William Lamb, Mr. Anderson, and through the influence of Captain A.H. Reed, F.B. Dean, and A.M. Knight, Mr. Anderson was induced to remove the office to the county seat of Glencoe. And that really made sense. That's where all of the action was happening as far as things to report on, the courthouse being there. It was the county seat, had a lot of prominence, great place to move the newspaper. And it remained there until it closed. Its name changed, though, from the Hutchinson Enterprise to the McLeod County Enterprise, and then to the Glencoe Enterprise. And we see this all through the history. Now, one of the things that we have at the museum is a collection of microfilm newspapers and actual hard copy bound newspapers. There are these big giant books at the museum with all of the newspapers that were issued. And as you go through the years, papers came, papers went, they changed owners, they changed names, some went out of business, new ones came in, but the Enterprise, it stuck around for the longest. Now, in 1879, the Enterprise was purchased by a man named Messrs. Of course, the Reed we talked about before, Dean, Knight, and Captain Reed was actually the editor. And Captain Reed owned it alone later and placed it in the basement of the First National Bank, installing a new press. And again, back to everything centered around this press equipment. If you had no press, you had no paper. Unlike today, where things can be done digitally and sent off to be printed. Subsequently, the ownership of the paper passed into the hands of Captain Reed, who engaged Charles V. Corson as editor and manager. Mr. Corson stayed for 2 or 3 years and was succeeded by Joel B. Heathole, who edited it for nearly 2 years. Up to this time, since being transferred to Glencoe, the paper had been run in opposition to the Register. Now, this was another common thing that happened in these early times in the county and all across the nation. You would have newspapers that were Democratic or Republican, so they had a bent. Now, we see this today in a lot of TV shows, radio shows, and this was the outlet for that information. So nothing new under the sun, right? So they were also supporting different political parties, and they ran directly in opposition usually to another newspaper that existed either in the county or in the actual town itself. But its purpose was, in the respect of, for Captain Reed anyway, to be this newspaper that had a political bent. But for whatever reason, he decided to sell again, and he sold to E.A. Childs, who was a strong Democrat. So things changed at the newspaper. So he formed a syndicate, taking in James Knoll, and they later sold to R.H. McClelland and Judge C.M. Tuft. And it's interesting that Judge Tuft actually had an office for many years up above the newspaper itself in the building. And he owned it actually until 1901. And in 1900, Frederick A.J. Tuft Hope, an old-time employee of the St. Paul Pioneer Press, and who had since returned from the Philippines after being with the Norwood Times, became a foreman at the Enterprise under the new proprietorship. And it was in 1900 that McClelland and Tuft purchased Lot 1, Block 31 in Glencoe, selling the old church building that was there. So remember that picture that I had shown you of the Enterprise building? So it wasn't until now that the Enterprise got its permanent home. It had been moved around from different banks and different places. Basically, the paper existed wherever the press was. But now, finally, it had its permanent home. Now, this picture shows what it looked like before there was an addition to it, and it eventually expanded, which we'll get to later. But first, I want to show you a picture of Mr. Tuft Hope. Now, this is actually a picture that hangs in the display, and it hung exactly in the same position in the office above his desk for many, many years, and many, many years after he actually passed away. And it went on to be owned by his daughter, Anna Marie Tuft Hope. Now, Anna Marie, a lot of people remember Anna Marie as owning for many, many years the Glencoe Enterprise. And we have a photo here, which is what a lot of people are going to remember when they think of the office of the Enterprise building. And that's Anna Marie sitting behind her desk, greeting people as soon as they walked through the door for their ads or to get a subscription or renew their subscription to the Glencoe Enterprise. So, in the fall of 1900, work began on the lot across from the McLeod County Courthouse to construct a 2-story brick building to house the Glencoe Enterprise newspaper. M.C. Madison was hired as the contractor, and he headed the brickwork on the entire building. And it was a beautiful 2-story building with offices up above. And on August 14th, 1902, the partnership of McClelland and Tuft as co-owners of the Glencoe Enterprise was dissolved. And Cyril Tuft actually sold and transferred all interests to McClelland. So why were these people passing this back and forth. But we find that in a lot of different interests. People were trying lots of different business ventures at that time. They'd come in, they'd come out. It was a prominent thing to be involved in several things, and lots of men were interested in newspapers as a way they could advertise for their own local businesses. And a lot of these men were not only owning a newspaper or partner in a newspaper, they also were involved in banking. They were also involved in maybe a local business of some sort. They may have also been involved in government. So doing lots and lots of different things, and things switched around a lot, as we see. On December 11th, 1902, Mr. F.A.J. Tuft Hope, picture I just showed you, who was foreman in the Glencoe Enterprise newspaper for the past 2.5 years, finally purchased an undivided 1/2 interest in the Enterprise plant. In March of 1904, R.H. McClellan purchased F.A.J. Tuft Hope's share of the Glencoe Enterprise, and Tuft Hope left Glencoe for Minneapolis. He wanted to continue in the printing business, and he thought he would try his luck back in Minneapolis, St. Paul area. While residing in Crookston, Minnesota in May of 1904, though, Tuft Hope resumed his position at the Enterprise and moved back to Glencoe. Again in July of 1906, Frederick Tuft Hope resigned his position at the newspaper, returning when in August 1906, he became the full proprietor of the whole plant of the Glencoe Enterprise newspaper. Would I have loved to seen those negotiations and what was going on behind that. But this is the beginning of a new era for the Glencoe Enterprise, because it would go on until about 2008 to be owned by the Tuft Hope family consistently. They also reported on all of the courthouse business, and I mean, how easy was that? They could walk across the street to collect information from all of the county proceedings and be able to print them in the newspaper, and they were the official newspaper from all of that time. So the Tuft Hopes now own the Glencoe Enterprise completely, no shares, and it was expanded, they decided, in July of 1912. So if you're in Glencoe and you see the Enterprise building today, it looks a lot different because of this large back portion that was added onto it. And this was to expand because of new presses and new equipment that was coming in. So the structure was enlarged. It was almost double its original length, and the new addition was 1 story high and built of brick stone, conforming the architecture of the present building. For the time, the Enterprise building was one of the most imposing structures in the city, and in 1912, it was owned by Henry L. Simmons, who ordered the construction of the addition to accommodate newer and more modern printing equipment for Mr. Tuft Hope's growing Glencoe newspaper business. The upper level of the Enterprise building also housed other local businesses and business offices, one even being a cigar factory at one time. And when we were at the building to collect the items that make up the display that is at the museum, we actually found some remnants of cigar bands. Now, we were hoping to find more things, like actual cigars maybe, or a box hidden somewhere, something vintage, but we did not find anything more than some old cigar boxes, but unfortunately were not the cigars that were actually made in the building. But so if anybody out there has any, please let us know, because we'd love to add that to the collection and add to the history of the Enterprise building. Now, so how were these newspapers made? And the one artifact that we have that is actually a large, and maybe in the picture here you can see the large boards that the presses were made out of. And these are actually the pieces, and I don't know if we can do a close-up on these to show, of the plates that would have been used, and this is considered typeset, and it came in lots and lots of different sizes. Now, because the Enterprise ranged and had such a long history and ranged in such a differing methods used for the printing press and printing newspapers. We have them in almost every size and material that you can imagine. So these are lead, and these particular ones were used probably for the longest amount of time. We also have ones that are carved from wood, so wood blocks, which have been even earlier. And then later, ones like this. You can get a close-up of those. But we literally have hundreds and hundreds of these, because if you can imagine, and we'll show a picture here of this typeset, someone physically had to design and place each one of these plates that was purchased into the shape of the newspaper. Oh, and by the way, it's all backwards, because once you roll the ink on and you put the paper down, to get it to show up the right way, you had to put it all in backwards. Now that's an editing job I don't want. That would have been super, super hard to do. And of course, mistakes did happen, but amazingly labor intensive and a lot of work to do this. And very messy, ink everywhere. Now we have some pictures showing some gentlemen at the press, and you can see they're not smiling. I don't know why. But I would have to imagine that they would come home at night just completely covered with ink and just, you know, exhausted from all this work. It was a lot of work, and it was also under deadline. These newspapers had to be out at a certain time, and sometimes, if something big happened, stop the presses, they'd have to rework it and go in and change those entire typesets, maybe change the cover story or something else in there. So, how did they get all of these plates? Well, there were mail order magazines like this. This one is out of Minneapolis, and this one was used and purchased by the Glencoe Enterprise, by the Tuft Hopes. And this shows all of the different variety of those plates that you could purchase and use for your newspaper. And when it comes to advertising, of course, that's where you could make some money besides in your subscriptions. You would want a great variety of these to help advertise for local businesses and to sell ads. And they even did other printing. So the newspaper would have been their main priority for printing, but they also would have printed checks, they would have printed business cards, they would have printed invitations, they would have printed pretty much anything that a customer would come in looking for to promote their business or to be used by a business for their promotion. So many of these were found. There's actually a picture on the back showing the business in Minneapolis, and all of the prices underneath. So these weren't cheap to buy, and I can imagine you could lose these quite easily. And we literally had drawers and drawers and drawers of these to be picked from, and all different font types and styles and anything you could possibly imagine that could be used. Now, the business end of the enterprise. Of course, the enterprise went on, but some of the ledgers that we have still at the museum's collection are really interesting, because it actually keeps track, and you can go through the years, of the people who had subscriptions to the newspaper, who purchased ads, and they all have accounts in these books. This particular ledger is from 1922, and it goes up to 1923, so it's one full year in this ledger. And again, someone had to physically sit down and write each of these and keep track of them. Oh, and they just got bigger. This one's actually says 1931, the Glencoe Enterprise. Now that's some permanence, huh? So yeah, you can come get a workout at the museum, categorizing these, lifting them around. Now we have examples too from the Glencoe Enterprise. These are some of their checks that were written and issued. I'm assuming they printed them for themselves. And just a wonderful documentation, just a treasure trove of information through all of those years. But the history didn't stop with Anna Marie Tuft Hope. The building was sold and the land, and it continued to operate under Kevin Johnson through May 9th, 2013, which was its final issue as the Glencoe Enterprise. And no, they did not use the presses that were there, although some of them were still there. At the building. Unfortunately, they were so gigantic and big that we could not bring those into the museum, although we have wonderful photos and documentation of what it would have looked like during the time that we were in there recovering all these wonderful artifacts for the collection. So the Glencoe Enterprise, ending in 2013, by far the longest acting newspaper in McLeod County. They covered a tremendous amount, a huge amount of history, and we are so lucky because we have a lot of the newspapers still at the museum that you can look at in our research library or check them out on microfilm. And the history that the Enterprise covered is definitely why we want to remember the Glencoe Enterprise and have this lovely display for you to check out at the museum. So I hope you will stop by, check out the Enterprise, along with all the other great displays at the museum, and stop by the research library, check out the newspapers. So much to learn inside. So thanks again, and we'll see you at the museum.